This morning's topic and this month's topic is one with the whole. And so what exactly does that mean? When we're talking about one with the whole, what am I talking about we are one with? Am I talking about the universe, the whole universe, just our solar system? Are we talking about one with God or spirit? Are we talking about that we are one with the whole human race? Or with nature and the earth itself? Or with life and what is? Are we talking about being one with the whole enchilada? The whole enchilada. When we look in the glossary of the Science of Mind textbook, Ernest Holmes says, when we speak of the whole, we are speaking of God. Our self-knowing mind is our perception of reality. It is our unity with the whole, or God, on the conscious side of life, and is an absolute guarantee that we are a center of God consciousness in the vast whole. Now, did that clarify it for you? What I think Ernest Holmes is saying is that we are one with God. That's what he's referring to as the whole. And he sees and we see God moving in and through everything. That God consciousness is in and through everything. So that means that we are one or whole with everything that I listed. The whole universe, our solar system, the human race, nature, earth, life, the whole enchilada, like you all said. Exactly. And so in the reading that Barbara just did for us, he says some interesting things that I wanted to reiterate and look at. He says, we did not create our nature. We cannot change our inherent reality. We are who we are, and we use this nature for better or for worse. And then he continues further on saying, and we are unfolding to a discovery of our true nature, which must already be perfect. Then the obligation and responsibility of this nature could impose freedom or bondage upon us. But our bondage cannot be real from the standpoint of the absolute. So that's a little different for us to think about this nature that we are, this God nature that we are one with, moves in and through us, and it can create what we consider both good or bad. It can be used for better or worse, and it can create freedom or bondage. How is that possible? What are we talking about there? I think that's a different concept for a lot of us. In one of the books that we're reading in our practitioner training is The Care of the Soul by Thomas More. Now, Thomas More doesn't profess to be a religious scientist, but as you know, we learn from all different sources. And he has a lot of interesting things to say, and I think he really puts into good terminology what this is talking about, what Ernest Holmes is trying to say here. And he says, first of all, that the soul needs an intense, full-bodied spiritual life as much as, and in the same way, as the body needs food. I like that idea, that our soul needs to be fed with our spiritual life just as much as our body needs to be fed with food. But further on, he explains and warns us, essentially, that the spiritual life requires careful attention because it can be dangerous. Now, that's an idea we don't often think about. He says it's easy to go crazy in the life of the spirit, warring against those who disagree, proselytizing for our own personal attachments rather than expressing our own soulfulness, or taking narcissistic satisfactions in our belief rather than finding meaning and pleasure in spirituality that is available to everyone. The history of our century has shown the proclivity of neurotic spirituality towards psychosis and violence. Spirituality is powerful and therefore has the potential for evil as well as for good. The soul needs spirit, but our spirituality needs soul. And he refers to soul then as deep intelligence, a sensitivity to the symbolic and metaphoric life, genuine community, and attachment to the world. And so that also is different than what we often hear when we talk about spirituality. We're often thinking, or what we've been taught a lot, is to be separate from the world, to detach from the world. And you know, what he's saying is in order to bring that soulfulness into our spirituality, we have to have that attachment, which I see as being one with the world. Essentially, we are one then with all of these different aspects of the whole, and he gives us a good way to look at it through that lens. Nurturing our spiritual life, finding pleasure in a spirituality that's available to everyone. It's not exclusive to just us or our group. It has a deep intelligence, which to me means it has thought in it. We're not just going with this because it sounds good, but we're thinking about it and using our intelligence to discern if this is working for us and this is the direction we want to go. And it's a sensitivity to the symbolic or metaphoric life, which to me is having a sensitivity to the beauty around us and to those things that we call serendipity or coincidence as they show up in our life, and also bringing into our life ritual that has meaning. He says then it's also genuine community, and to me that means an awareness of the Spirit or God's self within everybody, that connection that's showing up through everybody. The Spirit is not just in me, but it's in every single person out there. And then the attachment to the world part is the part where we are also one with nature, with the earth, with all that is, that all that has life, and even the things we consider not having life, the chair, the piano, all of it. To me, that's one with the whole, everything that has been created. So that sounds good enough for an explanation as to what it is we are one with. But what is the significance of that? Essentially, so what? So what if we're one with everything? How does that make a difference in our life? How does that change anything? How does that make anything better instead of worse in regard to how we're using our spirituality? Well, I think sometimes it helps to look at an apparent opposite in order to understand a spiritual truth. And in the Science of Mind magazine for this month, there's an article by, well, I think it's an interview with Neil Donald Walsh, and you might recognize him as the author of Conversations with God. And he has a new book out called God's Message to the World, You've Got Me All Wrong. And what he's talking about in here, I think a lot of us have already come to the conclusion that he's put into this book. But he takes it to a point where I think it can give us some more information about what it is we believe when we say we're one with the whole. He said, most of humanity has embraced what I call separation theology. That's a theology that says God is over there and we are over here, and never the twain shall meet. Well, I think, like I said, most of us have already started to believe that God is here within us. But what has happened through that separation theology? He says it wouldn't be so bad if that had been as far as it went. But basically what happens is that a separation theology produces a separation cosmology, which is the way of looking at the whole experience of physical life, which says that everything is separate from everything else. So that separation theology has led to this belief then that we are separate from everything around us, that we are different from the plants, from the animals, from each other. And a separation cosmology produces a separation psychology. That is, a way of holding our individual experience that causes so many of us to feel alone and lonely in a crowd on a crowded planet. So what's happened is that belief in separation has caused us to reach a place in our thinking where we then feel totally on our own, not connected to what's going on around us. And he says, and a separation psychology inevitably produces a separation sociology in which entire groups of people feel separate from, and sometimes even better than, entire other groups of people. And he concludes that this separation psychology leads to a separation, the separation sociology then leads us to a separation pathology, generating pathological behaviors of destruction observable everywhere in our world throughout human history and to this very day. And so we can see how the creation aspect of the universe of God consciousness is working through the separation theology to create more, to create more, to create more of that which makes us feel separate. I think when we're doing separation theology is when we start to feel like I have to fend for myself, Or I start to feel like there might not be enough because I'm separate from my abundance. I'm separate from my source. So how else do you see that separation theology, even if you don't believe that God is separate from you, how else is it still showing up in our race consciousness, in our world? Any other ways that you can think of? Ferguson. Oh, yeah, when there's shootings, so people see themselves. Essentially, what you're doing is shooting yourself. And if we believe that, if we have whole theology, then we realize that if we hurt another person, we're hurting ourselves. Yeah. Any other ways that we're seeing separation theology show up in our environment still today? ISIS. Mm-hmm. Politics.
Republican versus Democrat.
Yeah, we versus them, us versus them, all of that. Any place that we see that kind of thinking. And so this is what separation theology has created just through the trickle-down effect. Now, you might not think that you believe in a separate God, but what's happened is that ideology has come through our race consciousness and how we interact with each other. So do we like what it's created? Not usually. We don't usually like how we feel. We don't like how it's showing up in the world around us. I'm sure many of you have heard of Einstein's quote, "The significant problems we face cannot be solved at the same level of thinking we were at when we created them." And so when we want to shift from separation theology to wholeness theology, and we want to see how wholeness theology can make a difference in our world around us. And again, if you're not thinking in terms of God, I know some of you think more in terms of spirit or life, just bring it down a notch and see what creates what creates what, and where wholeness theology can lead us. Where do we need to start then if we're going to shift our thinking to get us from that place of separation theology and its residual effects? Because consciously or in our belief, we might say, oh, I believe I'm one with everything, and yet this stuff is still showing up and it's still impacting us. Again, in the same Science of Mind, there's an article, Mindfulness Matters by Dennis Merritt Jones, and there were some ideas in here that I thought really applied. And the first thing he says is, how do we embrace the what is in a manner that allows us to respond to it productively, proactively, rather than staring at it fearfully and giving it more negative power? And then he quotes Ernest Holmes. In The Science of Mind, Dr. Ernest Holmes writes, we should be able to look a discordant fact in the face and deny its reality. Note, he didn't say pretend it isn't there. Now, for some of us, that might just sound like word play, the difference between denying its reality and pretending it isn't there. But he continues to explain that he's admonishing us to look beyond its appearance and challenge the basis of its reality. And then he adds, it's easier said than done, and it depends on our perspective. But the idea is that we take a moment then to embrace what is. And that might seem counterintuitive. If we think about what has showed up because of separation theology, and that is what is, how does it feel to think about embracing that? That's a little difficult, but it says again here, and I'm learning this, and I'm sharing this with you because I too am learning this. The first step is acceptance. This does not mean we have to like what is. It means being willing to see what is as an apparent fact, while at the same time mindfully sensing the presence of a sacred, larger truth behind the fact. That's how it is we can face this thing that's showing up and deny its reality, but we're still facing it. We're taking a moment to look at it. And this sentence is what really spoke to me. Mindfully accepting what is doesn't mean it's our destiny. And I think that's where I get hooked in. I start to think if I look at something or if I am accepting it in any way, if I'm embracing it, that means that's the way life is going to be for now on out. But what this is saying is when we mindfully embrace something, that doesn't mean that is our destiny. It simply cracks open the door to a higher reality through which the sacred light of the true self shines in the present moment. So for me, like I said, that is one of my greatest challenges, is when something shows up out of that place of separation, out of that place that creates a sense of fear in me or distaste, it feels worse instead of better. My first reaction is to treat it like that hot potato, toss it off to the next person, or just toss it out of my hands altogether. Because I was raised with a mother who had this belief that if we paid any attention to anything we didn't like, it would make it grow. And that is what some of us come into New Thought thinking is what we're teaching. And yet, as we look at what Ernest Holmes is saying, and as we look at what some of our other teachers are saying, they're saying, no, we don't need to toss it off and pretend like it doesn't exist and totally ignore it. We take that hot potato for a moment, and we embrace it. We look at it. So I pictured myself kind of going, whoo, okay, it's hot. We don't want to hold on too tight. We don't want to get burned. But as we do that, it cools off. It gets to a point where I can really study it and see what's going on here. What's happening that's created this potato to become so hot? And when we talk about human relations, I think that is some of those sentences that we've learned through self-help books and through psychology, things like taking a time to say, sounds like you're telling me this. I'm taking time to listen to something I might not want to hear. Or can you help me explain what it is you're saying? I'm taking time with that hot potato where it might be uncomfortable to find out that person's perspective in the sight of apparent separateness from that other. Or as we use our community commitment, we're taking time to embrace the other in our heart and listen. Now, the other is that feeling of separateness. So as we take the other into our heart and listen, we're connecting with it. We're recognizing our oneness with it. And if our goal is to shift from separation theology to wholeness theology, then as we're doing these things, we're coming at our connection with other people and our conversations with other people from the framework of we are one here. We're in this together. You're not out to get me. I'm not out to get you. I'm here to support you. You're here to support me. So let's just figure this out. Let's look at this hot potato. Let's embrace it and see what's really going on here. And that's when I think we become curious out of love. You've heard me talk a lot of times about more curiosity and less judgment. When we can really start to get curious about what's going on in the other. Because again, we're looking at what is either apparent or real differences. And as we're looking at those and embracing them, we get to the level of discovering where we are connected, where we have similarities. In Care of the Soul, Thomas More also talked about our need or connection for the community, that greater community. And one of the things he says is that we go about that we're essentially hardwired to be in community with other people. We want that connection. And yet we go about creating that all wrong. He says we kind of go at it with sort of an anthropological, I'm going to study you attitude. So there's a culture over there that I don't understand, so I'm going to study them. I'm going to read all about them. I might learn their language. I might try out their food. And I'm going to see what's really going on in this culture by studying or looking at them from the outside. But what Thomas More is saying we really want is a connection with that person. We want to meet a real person and connect with that real person one-on-one and to really see how it is that we can move forward together in that oneness. And so because of that, one of the things that I've done this month in regard to this topic of one with the whole is I've invited a speaker next month who is from the Baha'i faith. Her name is Beatrice Ferreira. I'm sorry, thank you, next week. Thank you. Next week, next Sunday. Her name is Beatrice Ferreira. She practices the Baha'i faith. She's a lawyer here in town, but she is more about mediation than litigation. She will do anything to keep stuff out of court and mediate with people. She totally believes in the oneness and wholeness of this universe, of all the people within it. The Baha'i faith completely supports each person on their path. And I will say they're a little stronger about saying that their way is really the good one. So I'll let you know that we might hear some of that next week. But I wanted to bring in a different face of the same idea. for us to see how it is we can put a face on something we might not know anything about. We might have studied Baha'i or heard about it, but this way we're going to see a real person who's brought it into her life. She does a lot of social justice work in this town. She's helped a lot of people in this town, and she's fascinating. She could definitely fill up more than 20 minutes, so I'm going to really work on seeing that she sticks to that. But she's fabulous, and so I hope you come to see, because I think it's important that as we go through this idea and as we think more about wholeness theology, that we start to put real faces on those communities and those people that are different than us, that might be from a different culture or a different ideology, a different teaching than us. And as a kid, this was brought out to me in my life because my father was a Zionist, and he worked with Zionists from all over the world. And I had the opportunity at a very young age, I was in about 4th or 5th grade, to have a pen pal in Russia. And she and I wrote back and forth. Fortunately, she had some English, and I had absolutely no Russian, so we did this in English. But we wrote back and forth. So when the Cold War was going on and Russia was the enemy, I found it very difficult to feel any animosity toward Russia. And I only knew one person in Russia. I only had one connection, but that one connection told me they can't all be bad. There's something else here going on. And so that helped me to see that maybe we can't generalize this all badness with them here and me here. And today, you know, that in that time, for somebody to have a Russian pen pal was pretty unusual when I was growing up. But today, we have the youth that are interacting with each other all over the world. They're playing games with each other through the internet and getting to know each other from all different countries. They Skype with each other so they even get to see each other's faces. And it's amazing. This idea of oneness has really changed. It's becoming more real because faces are being put to the otherness, to the people in different cultures and different parts of the world. The other thing that I find interesting is that on the internet today, we also not only see the oneness of people, but we're seeing these films being sent around of interspecies relationships where animals that would normally be prey and preyed upon are now forming friendships in different arenas with different scenarios. And we're seeing lots of that, and also interspecies between humans and animals and the connection that's going on there. So this idea that we're separate from is starting to dissolve, which tells me that somewhere the wholeness theology is starting to take hold. And as we see it starting to take hold, it's going to show up in more and more ways in our environment. It's going to trickle down just like separation theology did. And so if we think about then our bodies, I use our bodies as a metaphor because this is a whole system that most of us are pretty intimately aware of. We know what's going on. And so if we think of our body as a way to see the wholeness, and we think about how did this come to be? How did we come to have this physical being? Well, I was amazed, and maybe you already knew this, but I was amazed in the astronomy class that I'm interpreting for that they've actually now proven that we're made of star stuff. That the way the solar system came to be was an explosion of a star, and everything in this system is made of star stuff. It's all it could be made out of. So we are all made out of the same things. And everything around us is made out of that same stuff. And then as we look at our bodies and we think, okay, well, our feet and our hands look very different, and they do different things. We know that we don't tell our feet, well, you look funny, so get out of here, we don't need you. And our feet don't get away with telling our hands, well, you look funny and you don't walk on the ground, so we don't need you. We know that as we look at this as a system, there are ways that both serve each other. And then as we look even deeper, we start to see how similar they are in their structures. And they've just evolved to do different things and to show up and look differently. And so I was then thinking about, well, we don't see our digestive tract, we don't see our heart, we don't see our lungs, we don't see our endocrine system. But if we were to pretend like they didn't exist, or that they were separate from us, or if we were to ignore them, we would get to know them really quickly, wouldn't we? They would let us know that they were there and they had a place. And so if we think about that in relation to other people and other things, and that we are connected to them the same way we're connected to all of these systems within our body, what happens then if somebody else is hurting? What is our response? It's like stubbing our toe. Or what happens if they look different? It's like the difference between our hands and our feet. And so what I'm getting to realize is like what Ernest Holmes said in that initial reading that Barbara did for us. Whatever is true of the universe as a whole must also be true of the individual as some part of the whole. And it's not just the individual, but every little aspect of every part of the world. What I'm starting to see, and this is the fun part of interpreting at the university, is all of these classes, and I'm seeing both sides. We look in a microscope and we see down to the minutest little thing, and it's still a system within a system within a system. And we look out with the most powerful telescopes as far as we can, and the fact that we've discovered there's more than one galaxy just boggles my mind, because in my day when we grew up we only thought we were one galaxy. Now there's many, and beyond that then they call the universe, what encapsulates all the galaxies. So it's systems within systems within systems any way that we go, and it's all part of the whole, all part of what we call the universe. So this month, our focus is on being one with that whole. What that means to us, how that looks to us. And so I encourage you all to contemplate this throughout this month and maybe beyond. What does it look like to you? How does it feel? Where are there places that separation theology is still showing up? And how you interact or what's going on in your life around you? And how can you embrace that? What does embracing it look like and feel like? And as you shift more consciously into a wholeness theology, into a oneness or connectedness theology, what does that mean in your life? How does that illumine certain parts of your life? And how does that bring about any changes? Are there ways that you would respond differently in situations from that perspective as opposed to a separation perspective? I'm going to invite you to go within as I close with some words of Ernest Holmes, and then we will move into a song that some of you might know. But just take a moment to go within. This is what Ernest Holmes says: we are cognizant of our relationship to the perfect whole, and this is his way of expressing this. He says, "Thou art," and he's referring to God consciousness, spirit, life. "Thou art the center and circumference of my life, the beginningless and endless part of me, the eternal reality of me, the everlasting power within me, the eternal good working through me, the infinite love impelling me, the limitless peace and calm within me, the perfect life living through and in me, the joy of the soul and the light of the Spirit illumining me. O Lord God, eternal and forever blessed, thou art my whole being."